Okay, so this is lecture number 1, and as we discussed, we're going to begin by racing through American history before World War II. Now this course is U.S. history since 1945, and 1945 is the end of World War II, but really none of it makes sense if we pick up there. So we're going to pick up and sort of go through many of the events inside the U.S. during World War II. But before we get to World War II, quickly, racing through hundreds of years of American history. And to think of American history, well, that's usually dated from 1492. Now, 1492 is when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. 1492 was the beginning of European settlement and conquest in the Americas. Now, of course, tens of millions of people lived here before Columbus arrived. Those people, Columbus labeled as Indians, a name that is with their descendants here in the United States, where we're going to pick up the story after World War II. Indians, the native people of the Americas. Now, the Spanish sent Christopher Columbus in 1492, and the Spanish were then followed by other European countries, all competing with one another to conquer and take over the Americas. So the Spanish, the French, the British, the Dutch, they were the big players, but other countries involved too. And American history really grows out of the British imperial experience. What becomes the United States started as colonies of Great Britain. Now, Spain was a big power in the 15 and 1600s, but North America by the 1700s was controlled by the British and the French. And the British and the French wound up going to war with each other in the 1750s, a war that ended in 1763. This was a war between the British and the French for control of North America. And the British won. The British won, and the French lost Canada. So the map you see there, see everything in yellow is controlled by the British in 1763, and that's because they had just finished kicking the French out of North America. This war is in Europe called the 7 Years' War, but here in America they called it the French and Indian War, because the British colonists who lived in America were fighting the French and the Indians, who had allied with the French. Okay, so when the French are defeated, the British now controlled the land, as you see on the map there, all the way out to the Mississippi River. For the colonists who lived in America, this meant that they were more safe and secure and protected than ever before. There were no French competitors to harass them, to potentially go to war with. Indians had been eliminated as a military threat all along the East Coast. So the colonists were safer and more secure. But Britain itself had gone deeply into debt to defeat the French and win this war. And so the British government started requiring American colonists to pay new taxes. To the British government, this made perfect sense. After all, like we just said, the colonists were safer and more secure than ever. But colonial leaders, especially elites, who would be most affected by new taxes, colonial elites rallied ordinary people to oppose these new British taxes. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, which is what you see them doing down there in that picture. They carried out riots against British rule. They were, in general, being pretty terrible subjects of the king. The king, of course, thought they should shut up, obey, and pay their damn taxes. And the conflict between the British government and these colonial leaders escalated to the point that colonial leaders actually declared independence from Britain. And that's why 1776 is such a big deal in American history. That was the date of the Declaration of Independence. That was where 13 British colonies along the East Coast declared independence from the country that had created those colonies, Britain. So the British colonies declare independence from Britain. Now, declaring independence does not actually make you independent. Unless the party on the other side says, fine, you're independent. And that was not what the British government said. The British government sent the military, the British Army, to try to regain control of the colonies. Now, when the colonists declared independence in 1776, slavery was legal in all 13 of those British colonies. It was not equally important in all 13 colonies. It was the southern colonies that were built around slavery. Maryland, going from there further south down the East Coast. Those were the colonies dependent on slavery. But it was legal in all 13 of them. And yet, in their Declaration of Independence, they said that they were fighting for independence because they believed in liberty and equality, that they believed in freedom. And yet, their governments legalized the continued enslavement of, at this point, 500,000 human beings. So, what might you call people who say they believe in liberty, equality, and freedom, and yet own slaves? What could you call people like that? Hypocrites. That's a good word for them. And that was exactly what their critics at the time called them. All right. So, that contradiction we'll come back to. But, as I implied a minute ago, they weren't independent after the Declaration. To actually become independent, they had to fight for it. And the leader of the War for Independence was George Washington, who you see crossing the Delaware River there as he crosses your screen. George Washington was the leader of the American Army, so the military leader of the war against Britain. And, if you didn't already know, the Americans won. There's a short history of the American Revolution. Here's a good short history of the American Revolution. The British eventually got tired of chasing George Washington around. There you go. Of course, for the real history of the Revolution, take U.S. History 1. If I was going to tell you one more important thing, the French helped. They helped the Americans. That was big. Okay, so the Americans win their independence in 1783. And at that point, the Americans, as we could now start to call them, controlled the land you see in the map in green, from the East Coast out to the Mississippi River. Well, a few years after winning their independence, the 13 states united together to create a real national government. They made the Constitution. It's the Constitution, the founding document, the blueprint of the country. It's the Constitution that really creates the United States of America. And the Constitution was approved by the states by 1789. 1789 is when the first government was sworn in. So George Washington becomes the first president, the U.S. Senate is set up for the first time, the House of Representatives set up for the first time, the Supreme Court established here in the first year of the government. So this is where the country begins. Now the question mark is there because countries come and go, and some of them last a really long time, and right now the U.S. is still here. Alright, so the Constitution protected slavery in several ways. For example, it said that if a slave escaped from one state to another, the master had the right to reclaim their slave. And it let slave states count slaves as 3/5 of a free human being for purposes of obtaining more political power. And yet, by the time the Constitution was approved, by the time the government was set up in 1789, slavery was already being made illegal in most of the states north of Maryland. Now, as I mentioned earlier, slavery had never been important north of Maryland. And so, when they were called hypocrites during the Revolution, they passed laws to end slavery. There. Stop calling us hypocrites. It was harder to do that in the South, where slavery was central to their economy, their way of life, and their culture. Now, as I said, the northern states ended slavery. The southern states did not. But where the northern states had ended slavery, they did not now treat those former slaves, those now free black people, they didn't treat them like equals. They denied them the right to vote in most of the North. They excluded them from all sorts of civil rights. So a useful shorthand to think of this now that the U.S. is created is that slavery became a distinctively Southern phenomenon. But white supremacy, just the idea that white people were superior, white supremacy was a national concept. So slavery became distinctively Southern, but white supremacy was American. And America itself expanded dramatically in the decades that followed. Look at the map down there at the bottom. And I'm not sure if you can see it on the video, but the PowerPoint is on our Blackboard page. And you can see the expansion of the U.S. bit by bit. So the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. acquired all this land west of the Mississippi. They coerced Spain into giving up Florida. They stole Texas from Mexico, and then went to war with Mexico and took a whole bunch more of Mexico. So by 1850, the United States had taken on the borders that it currently has. That is the continental United States, not the overseas parts of the United States that currently exist. As the U.S. expanded, slavery became a more and more divisive political issue. The North and the South ultimately went to war over whether or not slavery would be allowed to expand. That's what really drove the two regions into a civil war, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. A war between the North, which you see in the pink on the map, and the South in green. The war turned out to be so long and bloody that Northern policymakers, including Abraham Lincoln and most of his top generals and political officials, they became convinced that the only way to completely defeat the South and reunite the country was to free the slaves in the South and ask for their help fighting the war. And that is ultimately what the North came to by 1863, 1864. By 1863 and 1864, the North was now committed to freeing the 4 million slaves in the South. And almost 200,000 black men fought for the United States against the southern states that had tried to break the U.S. into two countries. And by 1865, at tremendous financial and human cost, the North had won. The South was defeated and essentially dragged back into the United States, with the slaves of the South now as free Americans. But what sort of rights would these 4 million newly freed people have? We'll find out.